It's almost the same applause as you got for Jon Stewart, right?
Well, it's the same kind of host, too, right?
No, my politics are slightly different, though not that different at times. Well, it's great to have David Sanger with us here today. Our stage is a little smaller. Our public is a lot more knowledgeable and is ready to ask questions. But before we do, we'll have a little conversation. David Sanger is the White House and National Security Correspondent of the New York Times, one of the longest-serving correspondents at the New York Times. He's got a great new book out called The New Cold Wars, and it's got a long subtitle, but it has China, Russia, and the United States in there. Let me get it exactly right. China's rise, Russia's invasion, and America's struggle to defend the West. A really terrific book. I enjoyed reading it a lot. David has been around around the world and around places for a long time. He started out in Silicon Valley and being an early reporter of what was happening there. Went to Japan, was both foreign correspondent and bureau chief, came back, has been really here in Washington and traveling around the world with the presidents, covering 5 different presidents from Clinton to Biden. On a variety of Pulitzer Prize winning teams, on the Challenger accident, on the 2016 election interference questions, and many others. And he's also just a wonderful human being. So it's great to have you, David.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Ivo, for having me. It's really, every book I've written, we've come back and been in Chicago. It's always been one of the most fun experiences.
Yeah, we always had to have a good time. In fact, The Perfect Weapon was his previous book, which is an HBO documentary. And if you now go to the bestseller list, you will find David's newest book on that list as of today. That's what happens when you come to Jon Stewart. Tomorrow he'll be #1 because he's coming to the Chicago Council of Global Affairs.
Sure, that's it. Yeah.
So, no, great to have you, and great to have everybody in the room and everybody online. Let's start with the title, because the title is important. It's not the new Cold War, which is everybody is talking about. It's the new Cold Wars.
Yeah,
it is multiple.
That S was chosen with some care. So the essence of this, and the essence of the S, Ivo, is that while there are superficial resemblances between the old Cold War that you and I are old enough to remember, and a couple of people, but not many in the audience are, this bears very little resemblance to the old one. The old Cold War was primarily a military competition between 2 states, the United States and the Soviet Union, and within that, primarily a nuclear competition. And we'll come back to nuclear here because it's been a big feature of the interactions with the Russians over Ukraine. But there was something of a predictability about it. And we had terrifying moments, the Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth. But by and large, you could anticipate the actions and reactions. You could keep a red phone at both ends and you knew who would pick it up. You understood who had launch authority. You could have letters back and forth between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and they could debate with each other. In the new Cold Wars, you have 2 major players, Russia and China, together facing off against the United States in what they call a partnership without limits. It's actually got some very severe limits to it, but it's interesting that they view it that way. That adds an unpredictability to it. We now have Iran joining their side of it. That's pretty remarkable. If you think back just to 2015 during the Iran negotiations, which I spent a year and a half of my life that I will never get back covering, Iran was sitting on one side. The Russians, the Chinese, the United States, the Europeans were sitting on the other side. That would not happen today. I mean, if you got those negotiations going again, which isn't going to happen, the Chinese and the Russians would be sitting on the Iranian side, which tells you how much of a change. We had moments throughout these new Cold Wars where I argue in the book, we ignored the signs that the world was not unfolding the way we imagined after the collapse of the Soviet Union it would. There's a scene early in the book, Evo, where George W. Bush and his wife Laura and Putin and his then wife are floating down the Neva River in 2002. It's Bush's visit to bring the Russians into counterterrorism soon after 9/11. And it was one of those beautiful nights in St. Petersburg. It was late May or early June, so the sun was up till 11 o'clock at night. We're floating down. I'm in the backup boat. We're not eating as well as they're eating on theirs. When we did have a brief moment on that boat, I saw this sort of hulking guy standing behind Putin, making sure that the dinner was served correctly. When we finally dug out photographs of this, guess who that was, right? Prigozhin, who later comes back into the book trying to fix the 2016 election, and then running the Wagner Group, and then doing his march to Moscow, and then stepping on the wrong airplane. So we went to reconstruct the conversation that was taking place on that boat that night, and it really captures the time. Bush and Putin were talking about Putin joining the European Union. You remember the discussions about whether Russia would join NATO. There was a NATO-Russia Council inside the gate of NATO. That's now the NATO-Ukrainian Council, but at that time, it did not seem out of the realm of possibility that they would join NATO. There's a similar and parallel story we'll get to later about China. But we went from that 22 years ago to Putin warning in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference that there were parts of Peter the Great's Russia that had been separated from the motherland and had to come back, and we ignored it. And 7 years later, there's a chapter called The 7-Year Itch, with apologies to Marilyn Monroe. He takes Crimea, and there are no sanctions for a year. And then, after there are a few mild ones, the Germans immediately sign up. Chancellor Merkel signs the Nord Stream 2 agreement to bring gas directly from Russia into Germany, going around Ukraine. So they got none of the revenue. And she calls Putin a reliable supplier. So what was he supposed to conclude if he tried to take all of Ukraine? That the U.S. would kind of roll over with NATO. They'd complain a lot. They'd do a few sanctions, and they'd go away. He was not taking a wild bet.
No, it's absolutely true. And you and I are frequently in Munich, which is the conclave for security policy wonks like us, every year. And Radek Sikorski, who had just become the foreign minister for the second time of Poland, was there. He said, at one point, we were sitting in a small room with a bunch of people, and he said, I told you 20 years ago that he would come, and you didn't listen. I told you 10 years ago they would come, and you wouldn't listen. I told you 5 years ago they would come and wouldn't listen. Now listen to us now, because they're coming. And it's true.
It is, but
there are
think
people
about
who
Munich,
got it.
The
right?
book opens with Munich 2 years ago.
That's right.
And walking out, so it was the weekend before the war broke out. And I'm walking, we've had leaked intelligence for 3 months. We're looking at the New York Times' own satellite imagery that we get from Maxar and other firms. So we're seeing where the troop emplacements are. I talked to a number of European leaders. Almost to a person, they said in 2022, I know the Americans think they're going to invade. They're just bluffing. They're just bluffing. They're doing this to get a better negotiated settlement. And I remember the Saturday before the invasion, Blinken was there, Secretary Blinken, and a small group of us sat down to have breakfast with him on the Saturday morning. And we compared notes on who had told us there would be no invasion. It included the German intelligence chief, who you may remember was in Kyiv on the morning of the invasion, and they had to airlift him out. That's how wrong they got it. And so that tells you how recently there was this thought that if you just embraced Putin, he would simply decide that the risk to his gas and oil revenue was not worth it, and that he would make noise about taking territory, but in the end, that he would think the way we would think and not risk the revenue.
So we got Putin wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we collectively got Putin wrong in some ways, some more than others, but clearly.
The U.S. recovered from that faster than others did, but we got him wrong for a good number of years.
We got him wrong, well, a long time.
Yeah.
China. The realization that something might not be working in the right way with China came a little later.
Much different case.
And so talk a little bit about both this idea that in some ways emerged in the late 1960s, early 1970s with Nixon and Kissinger, but somehow they could be our kind of guys.
So Nixon and Kissinger did the recognition of China explicitly to keep China and the Soviet Union from coming together. And Kissinger, in his last couple of months, he died last fall, I was interviewing him episodically for what turned out to be a 10,000-word New York Times obituary, almost as long as the book, but not quite. And
well worth reading, by the way.
Thank you. And in his last months, he was concerned that the very thing they went about spending their time trying to avoid was now coming to pass, the combination of Russia and China. He didn't think it would turn into a full alliance, and I think there are many in the U.S. government who agree with that today. But it clearly worried him that we had lost the momentum there. China was a much harder case because, as the book opens, Bob Rubin, the Clinton's Treasury Secretary, was going to China. I was just back from Japan. I was on the trip with Rubin. And it was really interesting. He was only the second U.S. Treasury Secretary ever to visit China. And I said to him on the way over, gee, how many times did you come to China when you worked at Goldman Sachs, where he had been chief executive for many years? He said, never. I said, really? He said, yeah, we didn't really think it was a big enough market for us to sort of focus on. Okay, that gives you an idea of where they were in the mid-90s. This trip was probably 97, 98, something like that. There were signs of nascent democratization that we overinterpreted. You'll remember the Chinese were allowing local elections as a way to sort of let off steam. They had a lot of people in different towns and cities who were concerned about industrial pollution, hurting their kids and things like that. And they were beginning to vote out corrupt leaders and so forth. And so we interpreted that as the country is on its way to much broader democratization. Bill Clinton went to China. I was with him on one of these trips and gave a great speech at Beijing University, in which he said the internet will not only set you free, it will eat away at the Communist Party, because people will see how others rule themselves, people will see how others govern themselves. What's happened instead? It has become the exquisite tool.
His line was, it wasn't in that speech, it was the one he did in the U.S. He said, trying to control the internet's like nailing Jell-O to a wall.
That's right. And it turns out that the Chinese Communist Party excelled at many things, including nailing Jell-O to walls, right? Yeah. Because they have managed to turn facial recognition, cell phone tracking services, whatever, into the most complete control of human movement and human thought of any society we've seen.
And yet we thought they were just going to be like us, and we thought that trade and so forth, it was similar to the German view of trade with the Russians. Here it was more extensive. Our trade and economic interdependence with Russia with China is real. It's
That's
big.
Right.
It's fantastic.
Right.
And we thought that would be a way to limit.
And that's why we thought we weren't heading into new Cold Wars, right? With Russia, with the Soviet Union during the old Cold War, we had basically no trade of note. Caviar and vodka, certainly something you would never want to give up, Ivo, but if you had to in the spirit of national defense, you would at least consider it.
Scottish whiskey will, as long as that keeps flowing.
That's right. But in the China case, obviously there was a huge mutual dependency, which then flourishes into the semiconductor mutual dependency that becomes a big core of the book. And what I try to do in the first 150 pages of the book is basically intertwine these stories of Russia and China and our misperception of both. The China one, as you pointed out before, came much later. It was really only after Xi Jinping came to power. And remember that when he was vice president, they assigned Joe Biden, who was also vice president, to basically work up the relationship with Xi Jinping. So Xi would come here, they traveled the US together. I remember being at a big banquet and I was sitting at a table, and it turned out I was sitting at that lunch that day next to Xi's daughter, who was at the time a sophomore or junior at Harvard and spoke accentless English and seemed as Americanized as any Chinese kid who came to an Ivy League school could possibly be. It was interesting that the leadership at that time was putting their kids in school here. They are no longer doing that. And yet, the intelligence reports all suggested that she would focus on the domestic economy and would not challenge the United States. We now know that within weeks of the time that he took office, he gave a series of secret speeches that we didn't see for another 4 or 5 years, maybe longer, that talked about building their nuclear force to the size of the Russian and U.S. nuclear force, building up the military, setting up what became a project, their Made in China 2025 project, which was to make sure that they were not dependent on us for key technologies, from batteries to semiconductors to quantum computing and AI. Very parallel to what Congress did many, many years later. We had every one of those wrong, but the one that we got the most wrong, I think, was this thought that letting them into Western institutions like the WTO would change China, and missing that China had a plan to change the institutions.
Yeah, and we're still living with that. Before we get to some of the meat of the book, one more sort of meta trend, which is technology. And technology sort of infused in the story that you're telling. In fact, you've already started about the internet and Bill Clinton, but you have semiconductors as a huge piece of the puzzle. Increasingly now AI, which is affecting, and David, you had an excerpt of the book today in the front page of the New York Times. For those of you who still read the paper. For those of you who read the internet, it was on the front page of the website yesterday on how AI was being used and thought about in warfare and successfully
and its limits. What it was not doing.
Limits in Ukraine. We've read AI, the use of AI in Israeli targeting of Hamas, a whole variety of things. So there's technology that is playing the game. And I think the change that we've seen is we thought that technology always benefits us, and we're increasingly worried that it actually benefits the other guys. Talk a little bit about
So Ukraine's a really interesting case because the technology has to mix with the brutality of a war. And in one, with the main argument of that section of the book is that Ukraine has ended up being the great testing ground for technologies that the U.S. developed and thought would be very effective, and some have been, and some have been complete failures. So in some ways, Pentagon is considering itself very fortunate in that it's gotten a chance to test out how some of these work. But it has come in the strangest of wars. And at one point, my great book assistant and co-author Mary Brooks and I went to go have dinner with General Milley in the last months that he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And what was supposed to be a 1-hour meal stretched to 3.5 hours as he talked about these technologies and what they've learned. And at one moment, Millie said to me, David, we thought at first this was going to be like a clean cyber war because the Russians had been attacking Ukraine in a cyber way in 2015, 2016, turning off the lights, doing all kinds of information operations. He said, then we thought about a couple months in that this was going to be a World War II tank war. He said, and then we thought it was going to be effing World War I, right? And the answer is it's basically all three. It's 1914, it's 1941, and it's 2022 to 24, all mixed together. So the U.S. goes in and says, okay, we're going to give the Ukrainians Project Maven, which was this project that began at Google, led to a big uproar at the Google campus where engineers said, we're not going to work on a program that's going to help discern targets for drones because they thought that wasn't a good role for Google to be playing. So the project ends at Google, but gets moved to Palantir and about 12 or 15 other contractors. And by the time the Ukraine war breaks out, they've got this incredible picture of how troops are laid out. And I describe a scene, it's in the excerpt in the Times, where an American general goes and meets a Ukrainian general on the Polish-Ukraine border days into the war and pulls out of his car a laptop that's got this incredible set of feeds coming in, satellite feeds, feeds from NSA intercepts, feeds from Twitter, feeds from Russian soldiers putting Instagram photos up that actually reveal where their locations are. This Ukrainian general thought his troops had just taken a town in Ukraine back from the Russians, and the Americans said, no, you didn't. And he said, yeah, we did. And I said, well, I'm looking on the map right now. He said, call your staff. He called them. He said, no, we didn't. So it was a really remarkable thing. But what have we learned over the years? That while this is helping us in headquarters and sub-headquarters, the concept of pushing this down into the trenches where people actually needed to see what the bigger picture was has not yet worked. We sent last year a bunch of American-made drones and gave them to the Ukrainians for both surveillance and delivering ordnance. By that time, the Russians, who had terrible electronic warfare at the beginning of the war, had figured out what they were doing wrong. They took every American drone down in about 90 minutes. And this was one of those programs where some good contractor from Silicon Valley had come along and said, don't worry, these things are invulnerable, this is going to work. Didn't last from 2 hours. That's a lesson.
It's a lesson. Part of the lesson is the U.S. is getting a lot of good information on the cheap, including the destruction of much of the Russian army.
That's right. And had you said
a remarkable?
Had you said 5 years ago that for under 5% of the U.S. defense budget, you could watch the destruction of the Russian army and learn what technologies work and don't, you would have said that's the bargain of the century.
We just took 6 months to understand, to get Congress to understand that that's the bargain of the century. Right. We finally did.
Yeah.
Admittedly, I didn't think it was ever going to happen, but I'm always a pessimist. All our friends in the White House and everywhere else said, "Oh no, it'll happen, it'll happen." And next week, it finally happened.
Yeah.
Here's the question: is it in time? The aid that is coming. And you guys have a big piece today on the aid, including
the ATACMS.
The ATACMS. But is it in time? And what has been the impact of the United States, frankly, dithering, while, in this case, Kiev was burning, literally?
So let me take the second one first. So I spent the end of last year and the first couple of months of this year in Berlin. We needed a little bit of help in our Berlin bureau, get some people out. So I went over, and it was a really interesting moment to go spend some real time with the European leadership and not just do what I'm usually forced to do, is you fly in someplace with the president or the secretary of state and you're on the ground for 24 hours and you learn absolutely nothing about what's going on. So what did I learn? First, this was a really damaging, long debate because it left the Europeans with the thought that certainly if Donald Trump wins, this is over. We're not getting this aid again. This is the end of the game. And that even if Joe Biden wins, the fight was so enervating that the Ukrainians and the Europeans could not count that the money was going to flow when they needed it. And therefore, you need a different structure. That takes you to the second one, which is what damage was done by the long debate. I think a lot. The Ukrainians lost ground. They lost a lot of morale. They lost a lot of people. And every time they fire off a shell now, they're going to wonder whether it's going to get replaced again next year. And the Russians, having completely screwed up the first year and a half of the war, are now getting their act together. They're building up a supply of artillery. They have a lot more people to throw into the fight. And we're in a position that if they do get to a negotiation, and all wars end in a negotiation, it's hard for me to imagine that the Ukrainians will be in the world of the upper hand.
Yeah, it's. I think that's what 6 months of delay probably does. I would agree with both observations. Deeply damaging to the country and deeply damaging to the Ukrainians, which is unfortunate because it was not necessary.
Completely avoidable. I mean, you would have gotten pretty much, had it gone to the floor, you would have had the same vote plus or minus 10 votes.
Absolutely. We'll open up in a minute for your questions, but let me put in one more sort of part of the story. Some of us actually in this room and online traveled to Taipei last year. You did. You went to TSMC.
Spent a lot of time there for the book.
Which I didn't even know what it was until like a year before going to Taiwan. It's the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. It's the most important company in the world right now.
It is.
And I think part of you write a lot about it in the book, is how do you make sure that the good guys keep the edge technologically in the semiconductor field vis-a-vis the adversary in the new Cold Wars?
So I went to Taiwan with two questions. One of them was that, can you keep the edge at the time the Chinese are pouring a lot of money into this? Although the Chinese have run into more blockades than they ever thought possible, and they are still not able to do what you can do at Taiwan Semiconductor. The second question I was trying to answer was, and I'm sure it's the one that you were examining when you went with this group, is there a silicon shield? Which is to say, if you're the Chinese, do you calculate that it's not worth invading Taiwan because China needs the output of Taiwan Semiconductor as much as we do? And I guess where I came out at the end, Ivo, was there is a silicon shield, but we're losing layers of it every year. And the big question is the strategy that President Biden is putting together now, which I think is essentially the right strategy, going to work in time to keep that shield intact? So what's the strategy? It's got two parts to it. One is deprive the Chinese of not only the most advanced chips, but the equipment to make them. And much of that equipment, as you learned on the trip, comes from a company that most Americans have never heard of called ASML in the Netherlands. And they make these machines that basically have the huge lenses and the computer controls that sit in the middle of every semiconductor fabrication plant. And some of them cost tens of millions of dollars, some cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but that's the equipment. And the Chinese desperately want it. There's really only that manufacturer and Tokyo Electron. And the book takes you into the story of Biden's secret negotiations with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who is about to become the chief of NATO, as he tries to convince them to deprive the Chinese of this equipment. Jake Sullivan, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, will tell you they think they have bought about 10 years with the combination of depriving the Chinese of this technology and building up the manufacturing sector here in the US, a technology we once dominated, and then in a series of small business decisions frittered away as they moved all of that offshore. And we're now desperately trying to bring it back on. But even if you take the Biden administration's most optimistic projection, we would make about 20% of the world's most sophisticated chips by 2030. So 6 years from now. And I think that number is probably a little high. And that tells you that we would still be dependent on China and Taiwan Semiconductor for 80%. And by 2030, the chances that China may have moved on Taiwan are pretty high. I mean, Xi Jinping is 70 years old. He has said he's going to solve this problem before he leaves. And, so assume he's got 10 active years left.
Yeah, or 15, but
he seems in good shape.
I think it depends. I think we may have a president who's going to be 86, so there's a while to go.
When you're Xi Jinping, you don't and take as much
his mother's still alive.
Yeah.
So there's hope there. A lot of people lining up. Let's open up the room for questions. If you want to, for those online, you want to ask a question online, go to ccga.live. Type in your question, and we'll hope to get to that too. Just state your name and make sure that your question is indeed a question.
That's good advice. I'm Michael Nelson. One of the groups of countries that we haven't really talked about, I guess, would be the I guess you could call them the global south, but many of them are not on either side of any of these Cold Wars. And it seems like they're actually pretty well positioned to take advantage, right? Play the West off of China and or Russia. Which of those countries do you think are best positioned to really take full advantage of this situation, of the new world order, I suppose, G0?
So great question, Michael. This chapter on this called, it's got entitled by a quote that came from a Singaporean diplomat who said to me, "Don't make us choose," right? Let us live in the space between these two, playing the two off. India is the great example, but so is Saudi Arabia. To some degree, so is the UAE. Almost all the places where you see the United States and China fighting for some kind of influence. In the book, I take you down to the Solomon Islands, a place the U.S. liberated in World War II. And there's a scene that tells you just about everything about just this dilemma, where the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, Wendy Sherman, and Caroline Kennedy, ambassador to Australia, meet in the Solomons to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the U.S. liberation of the Solomons from Japan. And Caroline Kennedy's presence is most important because it's in the Solomons that PT 109 was hit, and her, the sort of founding myth of JFK came together. It wasn't a myth. I mean, he really did save the boat and the crew. So they're there. And the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands would not step out of his office to come join the celebrations for fear of pissing off the Chinese. And the Solomons at this point is pretty much more under Chinese influence than the U.S. The bigger case here is India, which has been buying oil like mad from the Russians because it's cheaper now while the Russians are under sanction. In some cases, the U.S. has been willing to go tolerate this. In others involving new technology, they have not. And, last week there was a really interesting business story that was really a geopolitical story. It was a $1.5 billion investment by Microsoft in an AI company in the United Arab Emirates called G42. And the president of Microsoft is going on their board. The reason that this deal was happening is that it was conceived in the White House to try to bring the UAE and the technology under more Western influence. And Gina Raimondo was quoted in our story about it. She said to me, David, when it comes to emerging technologies, you cannot be in China's camp and in America's camp. You have to choose. And that is where this is headed.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great question, great answer. Yeah.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Nada Abbott, and my question is around our misunderstanding of Putin, or the idea is that the U.S. somehow got Putin wrong, when there's a larger question if U.S. got Russia wrong. And the history of Russia is a place on earth and never saw democracy. It doesn't have democratic tendencies and is fundamentally different. And as someone who was born and lived part of my life in a land that was occupied by Russia for several centuries, I can tell you that there is a blindness to sort of very fundamental nature of Russia and Russian people that is now showing its evidence in the brutality and unreasonable cruelty of the way war is happening. So my question is there a hope in any foreseeable future of a more sober view of Russia, not just as a geopolitical sort of clinical view of them as adversaries, but more deeper understanding of what Western world is actually dealing with, so that hopefully less lives will be lost and we'll have a more peaceful, stable world order based on maybe more adult, grown-up understanding of what Russia is and less of the sort of wishful thinking of what Russia could be one day.
I'm glad you used the phrase wishful thinking, because in both the Russia and China case, that was as important as the intelligence. In the course of reporting about this book and traveling around the world, I had exactly this conversation with Secretary Blinken, and he said to me at one point, if you go back and you read Kennan's initial article in Foreign Affairs, the X article, because they weren't naming Kennan at the time, or you go read his draft, at that time classified, cables back from Russia to the United States right after World War II, and you just substituted in the modern leaders' names for what Kennan wrote, he said, the analysis holds up pretty solidly. So that would suggest that we believed that a new group of leaders, starting with Yeltsin, but then moving on to Putin, were fundamentally going to change the country because they had decided that their economic interests depended on it. And I argue in the book that every time that we ended up working together, we inflated that in our own minds to believe that our interests were converging. I mentioned one, the Iran negotiations, but you could say the same thing about every climate accord. You could say the same thing about the effort to put together the six-party talks and restrain North Korea. And I could go on with the list. So I do think we deceived ourselves a little bit, because we couldn't conceive of a new conflict in Europe. One of the things that struck me about this period of the past 2 years is we so followed that wishful thinking that we stopped making old-fashioned artillery shells, right? So it's taken us 2.5 years to rev up a factory that's about 2 miles from where Joe Biden grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to get going. And I thought that was bad until I got to Germany and discovered they had given it up entirely and had to start from scratch.
Is there hope?
There is hope for this, but it's a hope that requires us to think, what does the post-Putin world look like? And we may not see that world for another 10, 15 years.
Let me ask the question that came in online, switching geographies, which is that is America prepared to see American armed forces to come to the aid of Taiwan in the event of a Chinese aggression, be it an amphibious invasion or an imposition of a naval blockade?
So, no, I don't think America is prepared to do so. President Biden has said 3 or 4 times that the U.S. would send troops in a way we have not to Ukraine. The first time he said it, the press office called and said, there's been no change in policy. Said, sounded kind of like a change in policy, but sure. The second time he said it, they had a very senior official, friend of yours and mine, call and say, really, our Asia policy hasn't changed here. The third time he said it, they never bothered to call. Okay. So the president clearly is trying to get out the message and try to create some doubt in the minds of the Chinese leadership that we may send forces. The Chinese have a reverse strategy here, and it's described in the book, and it's called Volt Typhoon. And while that sounds like a weather system or a bad science fiction movie, it is the name of a cyber operation in which the Chinese have placed malware in our water systems, in our utility systems. And the best that the U.S. can guess is that they want to create the possibility of slowing down our response to help Taiwan by turning off the water or electricity around American bases. A lot of this you're seeing in Guam, California, Hawaii. And so that gets to the real question of, are we prepared? Now, many in the administration have said to me, even in the past 2 or 3 weeks, oh, isn't it wonderful that we've now warned the American people about Volt Typhoon? We have gotten the FBI director to go out and testify about it in Congress 2 or 3 times. We've issued these utterly indecipherable warnings that the NSA and Department of Homeland Security turn out together. And I had to say to this official, I think if you walk down Connecticut Avenue in D.C. and you ask people, what is Volt Typhoon, they would stare at you blankly. And so I think there's this huge disconnect between what the government thinks it has prepared the American people for and what they really have.
Yeah, I think that's a larger problem of governance, and you teach at the Kennedy School once in a while, so hopefully the next generation of public administrators will get this one right.
One of the cases in our course actually is Chinese malware to slow down a Taiwan response. Yeah.
I know there's a long list of people, but unfortunately, this is going to be the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Singer. I follow your columns assiduously. In a recent column, you wrote that Israel sends a signal, not a real retaliation, to Iran. That signal was that they can strike wherever they want, whenever they want. Now, to follow up on that, does that indicate that Israel will tamp down a bit, or may tamp down a bit, on its attack on Gaza?
So I think Gaza and Iran are 2 really different situations. What I was writing about in the one that you accurately cited was that last weekend when they did that attack on Isfahan, they didn't choose Isfahan out of a hat. It's where the Iranians do their conversion systems for uranium. So it's where they turn uranium into uranium gas. And 45 miles to the north is the Natanz nuclear enrichment site. They didn't hit either one of those. They could have. And some of our colleagues have reported that the original Israeli plan was a lot more devastating. So that tells you that President Biden did get through to them a bit on this one about de-escalating. The big question is he also going to get through to them about Rafah in that regard? And we don't know yet. Netanyahu has every reason to keep this war going, because as soon as it stops, the investigations begin, the questions about whether or not they ignored the evidence of an impending terror attack begin, the questions about why the IDF was so slow to respond. And then they've got the question that Netanyahu laid out 2 goals after the tragedy of October 7th. And one of them was to completely destroy Hamas, and the second one was to get back the hostages. And you have now seen, more than 6 months later, the degree to which those two objectives are really in tension. So I think if anything moderates his response, it may be that tension more than anything else.
It's normal when we talk about foreign policy and what happens and what happens in the world to ask the question, what keeps you up at night? So you've already depressed us enough.
Okay.
How do you go to sleep at night?
Oh, that's easy. First of all, the days are long, particularly when you're walking around talking about a book, so I fall right to sleep anyway. But it's this. Yeah, we are in a period of remarkable tension, and I wrote this book to make the case that we should think about these new Cold Wars as the condition that we're probably going to be in for the next 30 or 40 years. That's a big change for Americans who grew up not thinking about, a generation grew up, maybe a generation and a half, not having to think about geopolitical struggle because they came of awareness of the political world after the Soviet Union had collapsed. And I think that's one of the reasons that as a nation in this election, we're having such a hard time having a serious strategic debate. We can get back to that, Ivo. You know, if you go back and you listen one day to the Kennedy-Nixon debates and turn off the video, just listen to the audio so you're not thinking about who looks young and who looks like he's sweating and all that. The quality of the debate about how to contain the then Soviet Union was pretty high. And you have to ask yourself the question, would the American electorate sit for that now? And I think it's pretty clear they would not. But I think we can get back there. And I think that we can get to the point, if we can stop ripping ourselves apart internally, to think about the United States and its role in the world. We are getting there in the worst possible way. You saw it in the debate over the Ukraine aid bill, where the Republican Party was split between its traditional internationalists and a group, majority of Republicans voted against the bill, that believes that you can go pull up high walls and basically wall off the rest of the world. It's an interesting theory. We've tried it before at several points in our history. It's yet to work even once. And so then the question you have to ask is, if we're not there to fill the vacuum, who will fill it for us? And the answer is pretty evident from the world we see and from the stories you'll read in New Cold Wars. China is perfectly willing to step in and fill it. Russia's willing to step in and at least disrupt our vision of it. And if we want to live with that, that's fine, but that ought to be an informed choice. And I think most Americans are not yet willing to live with that.
David Sanger, thanks very much.
Thank you, Eva.
Really terrific to have you here. Copies of the book both for sale and to be signed. Thanks.